In the previous lesson, we discussed using relative CSS units to create responsive and fluid layouts, all without needing to use media queries to apply different CSS for different screen sizes. The same concepts can be applied to typography and text. By using a combination of relative units, flexible units, and the CSS clamp function, you can create responsive and fluid typography that looks great on every device with just a few tools from the toolbox. First, let's talk about readability and relative units. Everyone has personal preferences when it comes to using websites. Light mode, dark mode, window size, and zoom percentage are only a few ways in which people can tailor their reading experience, whether they are visually impaired or not. In web browsers, there are settings for the preferred font size, where people can choose to use smaller or larger font sizes while browsing the web. Here's a basic web page to demonstrate the concept. You'll notice that if I change my browser font size, the first block of text doesn't change in size because it's using absolute pixel values, but the second block of text scales in response to the browser setting because it's using the rem unit, which is a relative unit. A rem unit in CSS stands for root m and is calculated relatively to the computed font size by the browser on the root element of the page, which is the HTML element. 1 rem is equal to the default font size set by the browser, which in most browsers is calculated at 16 pixels. Another useful responsive unit is the m unit, where 1 m is equal to the font size set on the parent element. Now let's talk about flexible units. You'll notice that when changing the browser font size, the fluid typography heading at the top of the page didn't respond to the change. But it does change size when I resize the browser window. This heading is using the flexible VW unit, which is sized relatively to the viewport width. So it's responsive to the viewport size, but doesn't respond to user preferences. To accommodate for both viewport size and user preferences, we can use the clamp function, just like in the previous lesson, to provide a minimum font size, an ideal flexible font size, and a maximum font size using a combination of rem and VW units. But there is a gotcha to be aware of. On this H1 element, I've set the font size to clamp, where 2 rem is the minimum size, 8 VW is the ideal flexible size, and 10 rem is the maximum size. But you'll notice that even though I'm using rems for the minimum and maximum size, the heading still doesn't respond to the browser settings. This is because the viewport width unit is usually the active font size selected from the clamp function, and on its own does not respond to browser font scaling. To fix this, we can do a little more maths and add a rem value to the middle value of the clamp function. Here, we're setting the middle value to a rem value plus a VW value. This means that now the viewport influences scaling in combination with user font preferences. Now this can look pretty overwhelming at first, but the most important things to remember are to use rem units for every value of the clamp function, making sure that for the middle value, you add one of the flexible units to the rem value, which is usually the VW unit for typography. Finally, I want to introduce you to one very useful CSS unit that can really level up the readability of your text and typography. Here, I have an article that uses the clamp function for all font sizes, using rems for the minimum and maximum values, and a combination of rems and the VW unit for the ideal flexible value, meaning it responds to both the viewport size and the user font size preferences. However, on larger screens, the line length of the text is far too long, making the article difficult to read. The optimal line length for humans to read is around 50 to 75 characters. It's one of those things that you can't quite articulate, but you know when you see something that's difficult to read. A common thing to do in this scenario would be to add a max width to the article container. Here, 900 pixels looks good on the default browser setting, but if you scale the font size much larger or much smaller, The line lengths are either too small or too large because there are either too few or too many characters on the lines for optimum readability. The good news is that CSS has another relative unit for this, the CH unit. One CH unit represents the width of the 0 character in the computed size of a font. So by adding a max width to the paragraph elements using the CH unit, such as 70ch, and your values will vary depending on the fonts you're using, you can ensure that the optimum line length is retained, regardless of viewport size or browser settings. In this lesson, we learned how to create responsive and accessible typography using different CSS units. Relative units like rem respond to user font size preferences, while flexible units like VW scale with the viewport. By combining them with the clamp function, we can create fluid typography that adapts to both screen size and user settings. And by using the CH unit for max widths, we can assure that our fluid typography is as readable as possible across different devices and font sizes.